Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us at, we're even early, that never happens at Town Centre events, for a webinar on journalism in crisis. My name's Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Town Centre for Digital Journalism here at Columbia University. This is the first in a series of webinars we'll be running over the course of the next month for a project that we are collaborating with a number of different organizations on, but chiefly with Columbia Journalism Review, which tries to track the changes and particularly the reductions that are happening in newsrooms at local level, at national level in the US, and rather ambitiously around the world. So I'm joined by three of the premier researchers and journalists in this area, and Kyle Pope, my colleague from who's editor-in-chief and publisher of CJR. I'm not suggesting you're not an expert.
I'm just not premier.
Kyle. Just not premier. Second tier expert, Kyle Pope. So we have Penny Abernathy-Muse from Chapel Hill, UNC, who is really kind of an absolute sort of world expert in news deserts and has been tracking them for well, many years. Sarah Stonebelly from the Centre of Cooperative Media, just over the river here in New Jersey, who's been looking at new ways of mapping losses in newsrooms. And Kristen Hare, who I think of as the busiest woman, unfortunately, in journalism at the moment, who usually writes on local news and innovation for the Poynter Institute, but at the moment is all of our heroes as she's collecting the tips and writing up a weekly toll of cuts in the news industry that you can find on the Poynter Institute site. Kyle, I just wanted to start with you and say welcome, and also just, you know, I was struck we were having a conversation about this project where the Town Centre rather haphazardly started actually a number of weeks back, saying we really need to keep track of this for our own research purposes. So we opened a spreadsheet, as all best projects start with somebody opening a spreadsheet. Then I was very struck by a conversation that we had where you said, let's face it, sort of in the next 12 months, everything is really going to be about that. So do you want to kind of unpack that a bit and talk a little bit about what why CJR thinks that this is a worthwhile project to pursue?
Yeah. First, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And yeah, I mean, it has become, I mean, there's been so much for all of us to write about in terms of journalism's response to the public health crisis, and how we cover misinformation, how we cover this administration and its response. But it became very clear, even as and you know, we're all, most of our staff is in New York City, and even as we've been sort of in the heat of this pandemic, it's become clear that the story really is going to be, once we get out of this immediate crisis phase and looking at the absolute wreckage that's going to be left in terms of jobs and outlets in journalism. You know, the media industry, especially the local news business, was not very healthy going into this pandemic, and even larger digital outlets weren't very healthy going into this pandemic. And it is just, I think, is going to prove just devastating. So it is an enormous story for us, and it sort of accelerates this. This move that we've all been thinking through and focused on, like, what is the next business model? What is who is going to pay for news? How is that? What are those structures going to be? Who are those funders going to be? And this has been something that's been going on now for quite some time. This event just accelerates all of those discussions because we're now at a crisis point. And you know, to your point, Emily, I mean, you began by opening the spreadsheet, and you and I realized that we both had competing spreadsheets. We also were tracking our own layoff tracker, so it seemed absurd for us to sort of replicate our work, and a lot of other people, including people on this call, are doing the same sort of work. So I think the first job is just to sort of tally the toll. Kristen's doing amazing work on that, and And then once we have our arms around that, then we can start thinking about, you know, what does that tally look like, and what areas have been hit hardest, what regions of the country have been hit hardest, what kinds of outlets have been hit hardest, and then both in the U.S. and abroad. And it's the same story in most of the rest of the world, or a very similar story. And then sort of like, what are like some realistic ideas about doing something about this? So we'll be working with TAO on these webinars. We'll be providing a platform for the research that TAO has been doing on this and will be doing. And then we'll be sort of finding a way to communicate more regularly with our readers and with TAO readers about what all this looks like. So that's sort of how we come into it.
Thanks very much indeed, Kyle. Just to explain for people on Q&A, please ask questions. If I don't pick them up immediately, that's okay. I can still see them and we will get to them. I can always already see and answer a question that I really want to get to. But we're going to hear from the panelists first, then we'll take those questions and answer them. And I want to, some of them I can answer, some I think the panelists can. So just sort of framing that from Kyle. Penny, I want to come to you first. Welcome. And you know, you're now an academic researcher, but was a long time news executive and the night chair in media economics there at UNC. Just tell us a bit about the News Deserts project and what you're doing on that, and how maybe this year is a little different.
Well, it certainly is a different year, Emily, from what you were just talking about. I kind of backed into tracking news deserts. My job is supposedly one of, when I was offered the position at UNC, basically coming up with business models. And what I started realizing was there was no way to quantify where the loss was the greatest. And so we started, as you said, for years. We started in 2014. It took until 2016 until we could finally get our hands around the data. It's one thing to start a spreadsheet. It's another to make sure the spreadsheet is giving you good information. And we published the first News Desert report in that year, where we talked about the rise of a different kind of ownership of newspapers and what kind of effect that was having on supplanting the civic mission of journalism with the business imperative to make huge profits. At a time, profit margins were really, really depressed. So we put out a News Desert report every year since then. The 2019 was delayed just a bit, and as it turns out, I think it is a good delay, because I think we need to stop and pause and say, what happened over the last 15 years, because we started tracking it in 2004 through the end of 2019, so that we know where we were before we went in. And I just add 2 points to that, back to what Kyle was saying. I take a very, I think, nuanced approach, but also a divergent approach to thinking about the loss of news. There's both the loss of newspapers, and that has tended to happen among very small weeklies and dailies, and they often have gone unnoticed because it doesn't really make headlines outside the communities where they serve. And then there's the loss of journalists, and that has tended to hit the state and regional newspapers much more than it has hit the smaller newspapers. And we have a loss of news in both ways. We lose the routine government coverage that brings transparency at the local level and connects us with our local institutions. And then when we lose the investigative reporters, the beat reporters on a state and regional newspaper, we lose something else. So in addition to tracking that, we've also begun tracking digital sites, ethnic media, and public broadcasting as well in this report that's coming up.
So those are new additions for the News Deserts, right? Well, it's a good segue into Sarah Stoneville at the Centre for Cooperative Media over at Montclair State. Sarah, welcome. You and Jesse Holcomb have just produced a really terrific report which looks at different ways of defining some of those gaps in news. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the work of the Centre and what you found in that report.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I'm the research director at the Center for Cooperative Media, which is, as you said, at Montclair State University, just across the river from the Tao Center. And what we do, our mission is to strengthen and support local journalism in New Jersey and increasingly beyond. We're having our Collaborative Journalism Summit today and tomorrow, which is our big annual summit, which I was just saying before we went live, is drawn 750 participants from around the world around the topic of collaborative journalism, which I'm guessing will also come up here in this context later on. But so we support and strengthen local journalism in the state, and you know, we're a fairly young organization. As the research director, my job is to conceive and execute an agenda that can support that work. So we've done work on, you know, the state's ethnic media, on business models, and on all sorts of different things. And one of the things that became very clear is that we just didn't have a good handle on what the local news landscape looked like at a granular level, but also then for the entire state. And so this project has been in the works for a few years. Jesse Holcomb has been working on it with me, as well as some other people, and he's been instrumental. So what we have now is a map of local news providers serving New Jersey. And New Jersey is a little bit of an anomaly. We're very dense, you know, East Coast state. Obviously, we're sandwiched between two major media markets, New York and Philly. And so that creates, so several of the local news providers are actually located outside of state lines. But what we found, and I'll dive into this a little bit more later, was that there are actually almost 800 outlets serving New Jersey. So, you know, obviously quantity does not equal quality, but I was surprised by that. And I should say too, that one of the things we wanted to do is map by coverage area, which, is slightly different from, I think from Penny's work, from Phil Napoli's, and I think, I don't want to say inflates the numbers, but makes the map look different. So I think it's a good complement to the other work that's been done.
Yeah, and it will be great to hear in a minute about sort of what those changes and new types of organisation look like. So Kristen, thanks very much indeed for joining us from. I can't imagine what your life is like at the moment. So you're manning, as it were, the switchboard at Poynter, which has become a kind of a central collection and publication point for this current crisis. Tell me, tell me how are people getting in touch with you, and what is your daily routine like? What are you seeing coming over the transom?
So I will tell you, I came back from a week off with my kids right as the world was shutting down, and as there were layoffs at my local newspaper here in Tampa Bay, and the trickle all of a sudden was a flood. And so I'm not normally a breaking news reporter, and decided that was not a luxury I was going to get to have anymore. And so started capturing each one that we got. Poynter has the advantage of being around for a while and being pretty trusted in our industry. And so our inboxes are pretty regularly full of tips. We try to cover all of them that we can. And I, was every day a story about one layoff or another. And at some point there were enough that a friend of mine said to me, you need to put these all in one place. And I had kind of thought about it, but I didn't want to. And so I put it off and I put it off and I put it off. And when I finally sat down and started gathering them just into a very raw list, which is really the form that it's still in because so much information is still coming in. It was pretty devastating. It was a Friday, and I stopped and, picked it back up again on a Monday. And, I think we published by that Tuesday, and it's been, hours of work a day ever since. My inbox is regularly full of tips from journalists. And then the Gannett layoffs that have happened around the country, which are supposedly not because of COVID-19, but because of the merger with Gatehouse, have been, another 100+ jobs lost that we're trying to track. And I think through all of this, the mission that I've always had to put the spotlight on local news and on local journalists has kind of persisted. And unfortunately, that spotlight is now kind of bearing witness to what's happening to our industry. There are still bright spots that I'm seeing and ways that journalists are telling fantastic stories. The money that's coming in for newsrooms around the country, we could talk about that later, and what it means and how those newsrooms will have to adapt to be truly, reader funded when that's not how they've ever thought of themselves before. But this work, I also have a passion for writing obituaries, and it's a project I work on with the Tampa Bay Times. And I find a lot of symmetry in this work of just witnessing and giving, names and attention to people that otherwise that it wouldn't happen. And that feels really important right now. And so it's not something I complain about at all. I'm grateful that people are still so willing to talk to us and share any information we can get. You're muted still, Emily.
That's like the things that you never want to hear when you're running a class or a webinar. You're still muted. Thank you, Kristen. I was saying I can already see some really fantastic questions in the Q&A. So, kind of we're going to get to those, I think, very, very soon. So Kyle, I just checked in with our spreadsheet. So one thing to say is that we're collating a lot of the work that Kristen is doing, that we've got from the work of people like Penny and Sarah. The bad news, as it were, is that I think as of yesterday, we try and keep it as up to date as possible. We had something like 500 entries from 310 organizations, and this is us sort of getting up to date, I think, sort of at the beginning of May. So there'll be another kind of tranche of those under that. So Kyle, kind of, in terms of, is this all, CJR sort of, I was distracted by Kristen saying that she likes writing obituaries, and sometimes I feel that when we're doing research in this area at the moment, or we're doing journalism in it, it does feel as though one is constantly writing the bad story. What's the kind of, what's the journalistic benefit? What's the benefit to the journalism community of us all tracing this erosion? You're also muted, Kyle. It's not like we can't operate technology at Columbia.
Sorry, it's my first ever Zoom call. It reminds me a lot of the conversation that's taking place around tracking the coronavirus in a way. I mean, it's like we can't really start to address the problem until we have a fairly detailed sense of what the problem is and who's affected and what those places look like. And I don't think that I don't know. I mean, I think this has sort of gone in and out over the last couple of years. I mean, we at CJR at various points have had a layoff tracker. And we would sort of start it up when things would get really bad, and we would do it, and then it would ebb a little bit. And it was a combination of us sort of focusing on other things, but there's also a kind of there is a, and Kristen alluded a bit to this a little bit in the fact that she's been able to sort of rise above this, but there is something that's very grinding about it, and that's very difficult about it. But I think we're now at the place where it does feel really important to map this out. And I mean, and the other coronavirus sort of element that you can bring in is we've also, I mean, one of the few bright spots that we've seen in the last few months is a very clear connection between the quality of local information and the availability of local information and critical life-saving information that is so important. It's not just a matter of information that's nice to have to be a good civic citizen. It's stuff about, stuff that could, knowing, which health centers are open and what their hours are and what their staffing is. I mean, it's all so very important. So I think in a way, this crisis is really going to underline like what we're losing when we lose local news. And I think that's going to help. It's going to help as we move into the next phase, which is what's to be done about it. And so when we go to philanthropy, or when we go to foundations, or even when we go to Congress, which there's some movement or there's some interest in now to say we need help, the argument is different and it's more urgent and imperative than it was even a couple of months ago. So, but I do think that sort of just chronicling this and putting it all down so you sort of see it in its totality is the first step that we have to take.
Thanks, Kyle. I just want to very quickly take a question off the top of the pile, because I really don't want it to get lost, which is from Jackie Newbury, who asked a great question, saying the communities affected most are people of colour, African American, Native American, Pacific Islanders. There's no representative of any of these groups on the panel. Future plans, question mark. To be clear, and I'm painfully aware that we have no representatives on the panel, this is the first of a series. The reason you're seeing the panelists here is because these are, if you like, our immediate collaborators. But one of the key things that we'll be doing, and we will have a whole webinar, which is answering exactly that question, Jackie, which is how do we change inclusion and how do we kind of, represent it better as well in the way that we collect this data, because apart from anything else, I think what's counted matters, and the way that we have been perhaps counting some of these things in the past hasn't shown up. I think both Sarah and Penny have probably something to say about that right now, actually, but this is, as I say, the immediate collaborators in the project, but we would absolutely welcome, and I can't say this too strongly, this is just the start. So we really want collaborators. If you run organizations that are counting this on the ground, wherever you are in the world, if you're a research center, local media, if you're a community organization, and you're keeping track of this, please get in touch with me, with any of the other panelists, because we really want to build this as a network that can actually kind of add to the meaningful data. But thank you for that question, Jackie. So on that subject, Penny, sort of you've already said this year is different. Can you kind of just flesh out a little bit about some of those issues, as you say, that maybe kind of we have to shift the lens of how we think about and evaluate what is news, what's important news at ground level. I often have pushed back at me at the moment, well, kind of actually Facebook community groups are news. Is there a point in delineating what are professional newsroom reporters, traditional kind of newsroom reporters, even in digital format, and organizations that might be doing news work in different ways in communities?
Well, I think there is, but let me go back and answer that other excellent observation about what does it mean for people of color, communities of color, underserved communities in the past. And one of the things that first came out of the 2016 report is, if we looked at it, the places that are most likely to have lost the newspaper and not have any alternative news outlet that's covering them happens to be the ones that are really on the margins. They tend to be economically struggling, much poorer communities. They also tend to be heavily minority or ethnic communities. I live in a news desert. I'm in one of the poorest counties in North Carolina. I vie with Robeson County, which is next door, which is an 80% majority minority county with a large Native American as well as African American population. My county is almost majority minority. It's right on the line. I was looking at a report that came out from McKinsey yesterday, and here's my county right there as the one that has the potential of having a major outbreak, right next to the other one that has a potential of having a major outbreak that will overwhelm the system. So my goal all along has been to kind of delineate where are we getting the kind of credible and comprehensive news that brings transparency to the system. I have a real problem right now knowing how many cases there are in my home county. I know the county just above me that has an excellent news organization has sued several times to get the local health department to release that data. And they say that what is being released by the state health department is 2 weeks old. So I can assume that my county that has a growing percentage of COVID-19 infections is also 2 weeks behind, but I have no idea where it's coming from. So I think part of the issue is we can say, yes, there's a Facebook group, but do we have anybody doing the vetting and the contextual analysis that helps me know how to make a decision today? And that's what's really missing, I think, when we say, yeah, there are Facebook groups that do it. Facebook groups are good at doing certain things. If there's a hurricane that comes through, they can tell you where the grocery store is open if you can get on Facebook. But we are facing something that's existential and also long-term here. That's not about bringing the power back up after a hurricane goes through.
Right. No, that's a great point. Thanks, Penny. Yeah, so Sarah, again, this is a core of what you're studying, which is how to think about including organizations. What would your response to that be? How do we, and maybe how do we see that changing right now? Do you see kind of the crisis and the pandemic actually pushing these changes faster in the organizations that you study?
Yeah. Yes. So one of the things we were really insistent on including on the map were layers showing these other structural variables of municipalities that we know are related to the health of their local news organizations. So, median household income, average educational attainment, municipal spending. And in the paper that we're going to write, in the write-up of this data, we're also going to include percent minority, communities within each municipality. So we know that these things matter. And previous research that we've done actually at the center has showed very depressingly that the healthiest news outlets tend to be in the wealthiest communities. So we know that those less affluent communities, those organizations were already very precarious, and they're, especially now, advertising dollars have largely gone away. People are pushing the pivot to reader revenue really hard. But if you're in a community that doesn't have if you're in a community that doesn't have revenue to begin with, or has lost their jobs or have been sick at a higher rate, that's really tough, and that makes me really nervous. So I think that's exactly where the philanthropy comes in, where the going to Congress comes in. And I would also like to second Kyle's point that this is such a silver lining. We would never want it to happen this way, but to show the importance of local news, right? I mean, it is really, that is something I think anyone can say unequivocally, is that we've just been shown so unquestionably how important local news is. But yes, so that's one of the things, the impact on minority communities and less affluent communities is definitely something we're looking at and tracking with our work. And one final point about that, I think that the timing of our map of New Jersey's local news providers was so fortuitous in a certain way, because what we have now is a snapshot of exactly where things were before COVID.
Just before, yeah.
And we'll be able to compare it 1 or 2 years out to what's happening. And then in addition, we have now the contact information for these almost 800 outlets. So we can send out surveys and other things like that.
Right.
Kelly, can I just jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Quickly? It's been now, when was it? About 2 years ago, CJR did a whole print issue on race and media, looking especially at hiring, and there was at the time a fairly intense focus around the fact that overall 17% of U.S. newsroom staff is non-white, which is roughly about half of what the population is. So there was this huge gap, and there was a lot of effort to sort of do something to hold newsrooms to account. We ran lists of newsrooms and that were the gap between the demographics of the community versus the demographics of the newsroom were particularly wide. And one of the things I really fear, and one of the reasons why these kind of projects are so important, is that as this collapse happens, we're going to, the news business in general is going to lose that focus. And without the data to really track that, there's no way we can continue to hold people accountable. There's no way we can continue to say, like, why, what are the numbers? I haven't seen a lot of the data yet to show, like, what percentage of the layoffs are people of color versus not. And that's why all of this is so important, because there is a real risk that we sort of backslide in our focus on this as an industry.
Yeah, and I think, as I say, we have to hold ourselves accountable in this. And, the field of research, we have some terrific researchers like Latrell Crittenden, who's been writing some wonderful papers for us at the Tower Centre, and which have been published on CJR as well. But those, as you say, the voices need to be there, the data needs to be there. And, we need as well to follow up. I think there's a great point that Sarah made, and it's implicit in Penny's work that we have this snapshot. And so Kristen, sorry, I just wanted to come back to you and ask about, if you like, sort of ask you to combine your new job and your old job. So you were looking at in innovation, and as Kyle says, diversity is such an important aspect of actually making news relevant and important. Innovation is something that we always think about, the news industry needs more of. Is this, are you seeing a kind of an acceleration of innovation, or is this something which is just going to halt newsroom progress in its tracks?
A great question. I think the thing that has been the most heartening for me to see is that for when I write about innovation in the time before, it in a lot of places, especially if those places were coming from legacy roots, felt like, covering a turtle race. And, it was just a centimeter at a time. And then there are places like Berkeley Side, like Richland Source, like the Seattle Times, that have just not giving up and are finding new ways to connect with their community, to reflect their community, to get funding from their community. And what I'm seeing now is those kinds of places who have the habits in place are ready to speak to their community, who have trust, are getting funding from their community to survive, to help them get through. They also aren't just dependent, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, on ad revenue, right? So they have diversified their revenue stream, the thing that we've been saying you need to do forever. And so even if you can't do events, right, that's out of it right now, you still have lots of other streams that you're getting money from. What's heartening for me, and this is a story that is on my, I used to have like a 4-burner oven of work, and now it's probably like an industrial kitchen oven of stories I'm working on and I'm going to get to when I can. But I've done several interviews for this story, just asking what's next for all of these newsrooms that have gotten money, like from LMA's COVID fund, for all these newsrooms that have suddenly gotten this infusion of money from their communities and they've never gotten it before. What's next? What has to happen next? And so we think about traditionally the funnel, right, that you want to get readers through. And I've started to call it, what we're in now is like the toilet paper tube. I mean, you're just going straight through to become a subscriber. How do we keep those people? What behaviors have to change for newsrooms? How do they reintroduce themselves to these people who counted on them for a crisis and make sure they know who they are? And the thing that I'm hearing from newsrooms that sort of, pulled their socks up and said, okay, we've never asked for money from our community before, we have to do it now, is this light bulb moment of like, why haven't we ever done this? We're a local business, we're a part of this community. And I think they're realizing that there's all these other places that have done this, there's success. So I'm seeing an inflection point for change for the people who are willing to go there, because it literally is, a matter of survival.
Right, and I'm sure one of the things that Penny, you had your hands up.
Thank you. I just want to add to that, though, and add a little asterisk beside that. I don't worry about the ones that are in affluent communities. There are going to be for-profit and nonprofit models that work for them. I am very, very worried about the marginalized communities, the economically struggling ones, the minority communities that weren't being well served before and that do not have a base to go to. They do not have the businesses to go to, and they do not have the subscribers who can pay anymore. I mean, so those are the ones that I am most concerned about. And I'd say also too, it depends on innovation, how you're looking at it, from the top down or the bottom up. I found some of the most innovative have been the independent newspaper operators who understood they had to get creative and innovative because their bottom line was so thin to begin with, and they had no one to rely on. Whereas if you look at the large groups coming down, it tends to be dictated from the top. I don't worry so much now about innovation in the newsroom. I've always said the people in the and journalists were much further along in the grief process for what was than the business side. But I really do worry about, even if you're very, very innovative on the business side, in many communities, there's not going to be either a for-profit or nonprofit model that supports that. And part of the problem is most of the nonprofit foundations are in the major cities. So we've got to rethink where philanthropy goes and where we can make philanthropy apply in a sense that it's most efficient and covers the most.
Right. No, I think
Emily,
that's an excellent question. Yeah, sure. Yeah, jump in, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I agree, Penny, completely. And I wanted to go back to Kristen's point about asking for reader revenue and sort of this, the pandemic as a light bulb moment for some organizations, especially local ones. This is something we at the center have been saying for a long time, is that local journalists need to do a much better job publicizing themselves and asking for money from their readers, the readers who are able to pay. You know, it's so not in the DNA of legacy journalists, you know, who are in big traditional newsrooms. And it's something that people are willing to pay for now. I mean, I think now, I don't think anyone thinks that all content on the web is free anymore. You know, I think that it is something people are willing to pay for. And especially now, you know, they are being forced to do this. So if there's another silver lining, it's that organizations that are in communities that have readers who are willing to pay, you know, maybe making that pivot, they're being forced to make that pivot now as well.
I'm going to go to the questions because we have so many great ones. So I'm going to sort of take them from the top. So Francois Hendricks is asking a question where he says there's so many sectors. I suspect I know how you're all going to answer this, but it's a good question. With so many sectors collapsing as a result of the crisis, it seems harder than ever to attract attention to the news sector. Is there a way, while collecting the data about the extent of this crisis, to also collect data, facts and ideas proving how fundamentally important it is to have local news outlets, not just for democracy, but for public health? And in short, can the project help building a case that the survival of local journalism should be a priority alongside funding hospitals, organised testing sites and stockpiling equipment? I mean, that's it. I just to add to that, talking to some of the epidemiologists at the University of Washington, Carl T. Bergstrom has a great Twitter presence. And if you want an accessible person who is a public health academic that talks a lot about, you know, quality of information, he's a great follow. Those academics have been saying that it is very difficult when you are studying pandemics when local news disappears, because that is where they get an awful lot of their data from historically. So there is a sort of direct relation to that. But that point goes back a little bit to something Sarah was just saying about how do we make a better case? I mean, Kyle, this is something, you know, CJR is constantly telling journalists how to do things better. What should we be doing about proving impact?
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of smiling when Sarah was talking because, you know, I do think that that the news side has been slow to catch up. I mean, they've for too long have kept the money away, the money questions away and at bay, and haven't really sort of taken it on as part of their job to advocate for funding of these newsrooms across the board. And you are seeing that change. Partly, I think it's happening because of the sort of growing influence of foundation and nonprofit funding. A lot of those foundations and nonprofit have pretty rigorous requirements about assessing and quantifying the effect of your journalism. So, you know, if you read like ProPublica's impact report, and they are probably the best at this, frankly, it is incredibly detailed about exactly what effects their journalism has had. I mean, going down to specific cases and people losing their public officials being thrown out of office, people being released from prison. The Marshall Project does the same thing. So I think that ethos is starting to spread. And it's actually been an education for me. I mean, I grew up in the sort of old school model where, you know, the newsroom focused on the news and the publishing side focused on everything else. And in recent years, have learned that you know, that to be effective, you have to understand both and you have to engage in both. I mean, my job now is as both the editor and the publisher of CJR. CJR is a nonprofit, and we seek foundation money and other nonprofit money. So it's something I've had to really understand, but I think it's incredibly valuable. And I do not to sort of single out ProPublica, but I think they're just a great example. I mean, you see those journalists at ProPublica, the individual beat reporters, retweeting their colleagues' work and saying, this is a great piece, really broke news. If you like it, support ProPublica, send us money. And I think that is just something that that the industry has been too slow to sort of adapt, but I think we're sort of getting there. And it turns out that who would have thunk it, but journalists are pretty good storytellers, and they're good storytellers about the need for funding for their own organizations.
Yes, they're slightly shy of PR, the good ones. So there's that. I just wanted to kind of go slightly out of sync. And Tyson Evans, hi Tyson, good to have you on here, has asked sort of that question again, but I think with the research sort of lens on it, saying, you know, yes, kind of we are tracking this, and really, if you, it's that what can be quantified can be managed. He's asking about how can we better understand the harder to measure question about the substance of the journalism that's disappeared and the impact of the loss on society. So I'm wondering, sort of Penny or Sarah, as with your quant hats on, what your thoughts are about that, because again, we have an opportunity here as a collection of research centres to perhaps do something about that.
Well, let me, one of the things that I'm pleased about is that we've got a lot of research right now on the quantity of what is out there. But we really need to refine what the quality is. And that was the nuanced argument I was making from the beginning. You know, people would call up after the first report and said, reporters say, I want a town without a newspaper. And I would say, it's not just about a town without a newspaper. It's about what is the quality of the news that you're getting from the news outlets that are there. So I'm really pleased with the research that Duke has done, where they went in and looked at 100 communities. The problem with that, and that's one of the things I'm trying to enlist anyone who gets a copy of the 4th News Desert Report, is to kind of take what the FCC identified as 8 critical information needs and go beyond just the notion, is this satisfying an information need? Is it news that is actually that helps you with the decisions about the quality of your life? So let me give you a classic example. We just analyzed a whole trove of data from Today In app that Facebook puts up. And if you look at it, it looks like they're doing a dynamite job covering emergencies and public safety. But then when you peel back what those actual stories were, they tended to be one-off crimes. So if, you know, there's a crime story about someone getting a break-in my neighborhood, it lacks context. If it's not news I can use. Was it a one-off? How did it all happen? And there's also a real dearth of the other kinds of stories that tend to circulate on the internet. And Phil Napoli at Duke has noticed this too. You know, it's the stories that you wouldn't think you want to, you know, that aren't going to hit the clicks. They may be about the quality of education in your local school or something like that. So we really need to, what I'm trying to do with taking the 8 critical information needs and getting people to seriously look, is this news I can use to make a better decision about the quality of life, and check out all of the news outlets that are there. We take some newspapers out of our database by using that, and we ask them to have gone to at least one county commissioner meeting or some kind of government meeting over the last month, and actually had a live reporter there covering it. Because you can have shoppers, you can have community newsletters, but a news outlet ought to be giving you news you can use.
Right. There's actually there's a comment rather than a question in the questions, but it's such a good comment that I'm going to read it out, which is from Martin Reynolds, who says the Maynard Institute recommends the creation of a new newsroom position, organising editor. I thought all the editors organised, but maybe outlets need to think about organising communities around news and information in the way activists organise around social movements or issues. Yeah. It's also about building trust and meeting folks where they are. Many of these outlets haven't served the communities that could represent new audiences. I think that that's a really terrific comment, and something that is absolutely should be in every newsroom's bailiwick. Tony Brecht has asked a question which I hear a lot, especially I have to say from people in the tech sector, which says, does it even make sense to try and fix or replace the broken business model of traditional legacy print media? Or should we just pivot our undivided efforts to some type of philanthropic donation model? That's not something I hear tech companies say. They just say, you know, journalism isn't working, let it go away and something better will grow up. Is it possible, says Tory Brecht, is it possible that in our current climate that the work must be purely mission driven and not revenue driven? Tory is the former editor-in-chief of the Iowa City Press Citizen, so thank you for your work in that, Tory. That's a great question. Who would like to take that one? Should we just be going non-profit? Sarah, yeah.
Just very briefly, Kristen, and then I would love to hear your thoughts as well. I think that there's an excellent article written about this recently. It was in the New York Times, maybe. Should we just let it burn? But by, again, sort of, I tend to be an optimist, so I always try to look for the silver lining. But I think that people will always want local news, even in times that are not a pandemic. So, should it just be mission driven? I don't think it has to be an either or. I mean, there has to be revenue. There has to be revenue coming from somewhere. But I think that definitely, and this alludes to Penny's point, which I also wanted to comment on about the importance of the quality. There has to be something of a mission there. Journalism, I think the reason why people got so frustrated with journalism is because in the 80s and 90s, there was 34% profit margin. I mean, it was ridiculous, right? How much news organizations were making. And it was because they were filling their air or filling their print with, these crime stories that were getting a lot of views or getting a lot of, or weather or, they kind of got away from that a little bit, right? And so now maybe they're getting back to that and saying with the ProPublicas of the world, with the news organizations that are really putting mission first and kind of reorienting. So I think that that's something that should be front and center, but also there has to be revenue, of course, coming from
I would just like to shout out for the weather. I've always thought like really great weather coverage and how it segues into climate coverage. So anyway, that's my
right.
That's my personal obsession. If I was doing anything, I would go away and start a weather site. Sorry, Kristen, did you have something to say on that?
Yeah, I think that, I agree with Sarah, it's not going to be either or. And I think every community and its needs and its resources and its opportunities are going to be different. And so the biggest thing that we're going to see in whatever the after of this is that and I think we've known this for a while, there's no one model that works everywhere. And the former director of Lion once explained nonprofit newsrooms in a way that I think makes a lot of sense. He said, that nonprofit is not a business model, it is a tax status. Those newsrooms still have to make a profit. They have to pay their employees. They have to keep the lights on. And many newsrooms that launch independently, start with one person that I have interviewed, those people don't pay themselves for years. So I think there are lots of smart ways to go about this. I think one of the things we're seeing now with the continued consolidation, which Penny has talked a lot about, is those newsrooms feel farther and farther away, publicly facing from the sort of the community roots and the missions that we know that they have. I mean, we saw this when years ago, USA Today, Gannett went through and scrubbed everybody's mastheads and gave them all the blue dot. And so I believe most journalists know what their missions are and that the editors and the newsrooms feel that. But I think they need to do a better job of telling their communities what that is. And I think, as much as you can harness the expertise of people like Tori in their communities who are no longer covering their communities to do new things and find new ways to tell us stories. We need those voices, and the institutional knowledge that newspapers have kind of in spite of themselves right now is still really, really valuable. We need those kinds of places doing the nuts and bolts work of journalism.
Great. I'm going to try and rip through a few questions here because we're, wow, as 48 minutes has gone very quickly. Erwin Chen is asking, will the news deserts data be made available for other organisations to use? I can't speak for Penny. Certainly the journalism crisis, the spreadsheet that the Tower Centre's compiling will absolutely be made available. We want all of our data to be open source so people can use it for research and examine it and add to it and critique it. But we want it to be clean and fact checked before we put it out there. So, you know, if you follow @Tower Centre on Twitter or sign up for our newsletter, you'll be the first to know when that data is released. And I'm sure Penny's signalling that she is a data releaser as well.
Yes, you can go to US News Deserts and we will be glad to share anything as long as your mission is the same as ours. I hate to say it, that we have had a couple of enterprises that are more intent on putting newspapers out of business than on helping solve the problem. So we just ask you to let us know what you intend to use it for. We've shared it with hundreds of scholars already, and have shared it with quite a few industry organizations too. So. Yes.
Penny is a generous and well-motivated collaborator. David Clinch, hey David, good to see you here. What are some ways for tech platforms to support news organizations by funding their access to resources as opposed to, or in addition to, providing direct funding or grants? I could go on for hours about this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to ask the panel. I'm just going to say, Facebook, great, thank you very much. $25 million for local journalism, that's very welcome. Facebook's expenditure on its own oversight board is $130 million. Just leaving that there. So that's a great question, though. What else could we get from platforms? Who would like to take that other than their money, which I think is personally quite valuable? Nodding. Nobody wants anything from the platforms. I would say
the expert on this, but I was just reading how other countries are doing so much. Right, other countries are doing more than the U.S., and I think that is encouraging. Even if we get it done here, you know, there will be models.
Right, and I think sort of from platforms, I mean, one thing that absolutely frustrates me is that the limited data that you can actually still get on stories and outputs and what happens to it. So the platforms have become a little bit more reflexive on this, but for instance, we were trying to do some story tracking from CrowdTangle, which is one of the only tools that we have to show how stories are doing. It's okay, but it doesn't go back far enough. We found that our access to other platforms is very limited. So just in terms of understanding how the whole ecosystem is working, I think is useful for news organizations. Everything I hear from inside news organizations is, yeah, sure, they're getting better at giving us our data. Maybe some help with things like tools. My issue perhaps with platforms and tools is that they have lots of initiatives out there. They're very well motivated. They nearly always collect around the platform's tool set themselves. And that raises a huge question, which is, you know, do we really want everything to be enclosed by these kind of controllers of the media? Are you signaling at me, Kyle, or are you scratching your face? Scratching your face.
Yeah, it's more the latter, but and partly it's like you know, like following my school teacher dictum, like if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything. But I did want to sort of like go as it relates to the social networks and their funding of journalism, which I think has been largely a PR move in my view. I did want to go and address something that you were talking is related about this notion that like, why don't we just give up on the old business models? And I actually think that is an idea that is being misrepresented. I mean, I think, you know, if you look at the people in Cleveland, it's not that they are sad that there's not going to be a print version of the Cleveland Plain Dealer landing in their driveway. They're sad because there are going to be no reporters or very few reporters writing about what goes on in Cleveland. I mean, most journalists in newsrooms are realistic about print versus digital, and they know what the future is, and they know what direction they need to go to. It's not like they're trying to hold on to the idea of keeping a printing press going. And I think sort of the idea that that's what they're holding on to, and that's the business model that people are cherishing, I think that's false. I think what we're talking about here is like, who's going to be gathering this information and who is going to be holding people to account.
I think that's a great point. Just sort of like scrolling down the questions. We're not going to get to everybody. I'm really sorry about this, but we are going to be doing these almost on a weekly basis. So I will capture the best of the questions and we'll try and come back to them or maybe answer them offline. But there is one here which I just think is very close to my heart. Not just because of the age I am, from Isaac Fornarola, who asks, some of these who are most at risk from COVID-19 are not digital readers. They're the elderly, they live in rural areas with really poor broadband access. You are literally describing my mother. I'm an editor at a newspaper in Vermont where all these people make up the majority of our readership. What are some strategies for keeping our focus on digital transformation while ensuring we reach those readers? I've seen print editors sort of reduced to tears by the letters they're getting from, elderly readers, people in care homes saying, please don't stop printing papers. I mean, does anyone have an answer for that? Because it's a really impossible kind of question, I think.
I don't think it's an either or. Again, I do think that we're starting to see in the US some really great text programs where we can reach people who aren't either traditional news consumers or they don't have broadband, but they do have cell phones and they are able to be and to get text messaging. That I think is an option that we've seen around the rest of the world with WhatsApp, which is maybe not an ideal platform. I know that Advance is working with a text project, and I think if you can do it, and there's some smaller ones that are happening around the country, and if you can do it in a way that is beneficial to the reader and is not just an effort to pull in more money, not that I don't like money, but that I think is one option for some of those communities, assuming that they have cell phones. I mean,
well, I think also we just haven't really innovated in print. I know that sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but kind of if you decentralize print, if you make it much easier to produce low-cost papers, there's a great project for a while in the UK called Newspaper Club, where you could actually do a kind of a print sort of short run, and you didn't have to run kind of full cost presses all the time, and then you can actually reach those communities where they are. It's not a complete answer, but it's something which I think as the question was saying, kind of it's important when we talk about building communities not to forget the people who've been supporting and who really depend on that information.
Just really quickly to build on that, I mean, I think it might also be that print hasn't been rethought, right? I mean, it's kind of a victim of the 80s and 90s where it was like you have like so many people working designing, and I mean, you'd think with digital, the cost could be brought so far down and that it could be just stripped to the barest, so they could still get the information. One would think. I don't have any expertise on that, but it's just occurring to me that like it probably, you're right, hasn't been innovated. Right.
There's a question I do want to get. We've got 4 minutes. This is going to be like the speed round. I wanted to get in John Roach here. He said, I teach journalism at Western Connecticut State University. John, thank you for your service. You're doing great, God's work. Any advice on where to focus in terms of skills and career planning I could share with graduating journalists, current undergrads and prospective journalism students, besides be a plumber, which I usually start my advice with? Skills for graduating journalists. That's good. You're all unmuting. Kristen, what should people be doing?
You have to understand the business model. You have to understand how the business of what we do works, and you have to be devoted to understanding sort of the bottom line of everything that you create. And that is a brutal thing to look at. There are lots of different ways to measure that, but you can't. It's not just about I think the stuff that a lot of us graduated thinking about. I think you have to think about sort of the whole picture now in a way that you didn't. So, brush up on your economics.
Let me just add, thank you, John. I'm going to add that too, from what Emily has said. I teach a lot of future journalists, and I think that the one thing I try to stress is the real need for contextual reporting. I think that we've gotten so focused on digital skills that the reason I went into journalism to begin with was that whole notion of explaining something that was complicated and making it news that someone could use. And so I think anything that shows you how to use the digital skills to help people understand something better is something that fires the imagination of journalists and the passion of journalists.
I would just add to that, and I can see one of my students is actually on the questions, and I'm not going to get to her question. I'm really sorry, Satu. But one of the things we've just been teaching is reporting and explaining the actual digital information environment. Why are you seeing that group on Facebook about opening up the state? Who's paying for the news that you're seeing? Why are these messages reaching you? I mean, this is maybe a niche, but we're finding, I think, that every journalist in whichever sector, whether it's health, whether it's government, whether it's finance, you need to be able to explain to your communities why they are seeing what they're seeing on their devices, and some, you know, why is the Epoch Times coming through my front door? So that, I think, is actually, and it speaks to the business model point that Kristen made, which is you can really get people to pay attention. I'm really sorry because we are up to time and we are going to have to go. I'm going to make two promises, one of which is that we are going to get to these questions in here. There are several business model questions. There's a really great question about skills around connecting with communities. We're going to come to those in sessions that we'll be doing over the course of the next month. Very quickly, can everybody tell me just quickly and clearly where people can get hold of you or where they can see your work if you don't want them to get hold of you personally? Penny.
Yeah, so you can go to the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media. There is my email address is there as well, and you can go to usnewsdeserts.com and send me a note there too.
You can find me at newsecosystems.org. We have our map and related work there, and also my email address is all over that website.
And I am at pointer.org. You can find my work there. I'm on Twitter at Kristen Hare, and my email address is khare@pointer.org.
And we're at cjr.org and on Twitter, and you can also find a link there to subscribe to our daily newsletter, which does a good job on the synthesis question that we were talking about earlier. It's called the Media Today. Anyway, our email addresses are also on cjr.org.
And we publish as the Town Centre on CJR also, so you can find us at cjr.com, cjr.org, in fact, /Tau. And if you follow at Town Centre, you'll see the links to our newsletters. Sign up there. I can be found on the Columbia Journalism School website. All of my information is horribly public as well. So thank you. First of all, thank you, panel, so much for giving up your time and your insight. It's great to be collaborating with you. We have more collaborators in the Q&A, which is great. Anyone who wants to help with the project, please get in touch with me. Please get in touch with Kyle or any of our other collaborators, and we will plug you into the giant spreadsheet project. We will be back next week. As I say, follow CJR and follow the Town Centre for the timing and content of our next webinar. And I just want to thank everyone for being engaged and asking such great questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, guys.